Now, did you guys know that 70% of ortho cases that you can treat with aligners involve some degree of crowding? Right? So 70%, so 7 out of 10, mostly going to be crowding cases. This is kind of the bulk of stuff. And so there's 4 different ways that you guys can actually solve crowding with aligners for your patients. I've used different strategies to do it on these cases here that I've shown you guys. I used 2 different strategies for those, but it wasn't always like this, because honestly, when I started out doing aligners, I didn't even know what strategies to use. I didn't know there were different ways that you could solve it. I just thought you put plastic on the teeth and then they move and you're good. But we are going to go over 4 different ways to do this, and then I'm going to also just kind of give you guys them in order from least to most effective. So why does crowding happen in the first place? This is, again, like I said earlier, it's meant for adult ortho, but crowding at the end of the day is a spacing issue, right? We have usually narrow arches that are pushing the teeth together, and that's what causes the overlap in the front, because there's just not enough space. And so you have to remember that when we're doing adult ortho, that everybody's situation is different, right? And the whole reason why you're doing adult ortho in the first place is because something is off. Something is not ideal. Something is unhealthy. So it's important to assess each individual patient and not just generalize them. And then you got to use a combination of these strategies that I'm going to share with you guys, right? There's not just one way to solve crowding. So kind of dialing in a little bit to the anatomy. So everybody's ramus is a rainbow shape, okay? And then on top of the ramus, you've got the basal bone. And then on top of that, you've got the alveolar bone, right? Those are the 3 layers of your bone. Now, shape-wise, your alveolar bone comes in different shapes. That's the top layer. You've got rainbow, which is some of the arches that you see. You've got V-shaped, okay? And then you've got omega-shaped, where basically it kind of dips in. And I'll show you guys a visual in a bit. And so when the shape of the alveolar bone is not a rainbow, that's when you're going to have spacing issues, right? Because if the actual bone is constricted and it's in a V shape, there's not enough space for the teeth, because the teeth are just going to come right out of that. So an easy way to create space would be to just move everything backwards, right? Like just kind of move it back so that way you can kind of open up things. And so that's what we call distalization. Right? So a way to solve crowding is by distalizing the teeth, moving everything back so that way you can create the space up front. And so my question is, like, is this predictable with aligners? And it's not the most predictable thing. So second molar distalization, this is kind of what it looks like from a visual aspect, but you're taking that second molar first, and then you're moving it to the distal. And then that space, you've created space between the second and the first molar. So now you move the first molar into that space. Now you've created space between the molar and the premolar. And so you sequentially do that, and as you do it, you'll be able to have everything in a healthier spot. But this takes a long time to do, right? It takes a long time, and you need more than just aligners. You need appliances that you can use on the teeth. For example, elastics. Elastics would help, the carrier appliance as well. So this is where it's just like, cool, let's just like get this to ortho. Like this is gonna take a while, it's doable, but I don't wanna do it. Like I said, 6 to 8 months, it's not gonna fall in that category, so that's your first filter. Just get it out to ortho. And the old school way of creating space for crowding spaces, it's probably the most aggressive way to do it, and it's pretty barbaric. And there wasn't like traditional techniques, or there wasn't fancy techniques back in the day. You would literally just take out the first premolars. You'd be like, cool, we don't have space, we're just gonna go ahead and rip these teeth out. And now we have space. Oh my gosh, this is amazing. Now we can just move the teeth into that space. It's like magic.
So if you're a dentist who wants to get confidence with aligners and you just don't know where to start, be sure to check out one of my free trainings. But if you want something that's more structured with some implementation resources and support, then you might be a good fit for our course, Aligner Blueprint. It has helped hundreds of dentists generate over $9 million in aligners alone, and they've all been able to do cases with confidence. The links for all those are in the description below, so you can go ahead ahead, check that out, or go to our website, clearalineradvisor.co, and that's where you'll find all this information.
And so this is an example of kind of what that would look like, right? So looks like they extracted their premolars here in this picture here, and then they just took everything and just moved it back, okay? So with aligners, this is also not the most predictable thing, because when you're trying to do any type of like mesial distal translation, so bodily translation, just moving them, it's possible, but it's not the most predictable thing because you're gonna get a tipping motion, right? So if you think about the crown of the tooth being above the bone level, and you try to put force to move this backwards, you see how this just tips out, right? The root stays here. What you want for translation is you want the whole thing to be pushed back. And so most of the movements with aligners is a lot of tipping, right? And when you're rotating, so it's all kind of above the bone level. And to get those bodily translations, it is possible, but it just takes a lot, or it takes longer because of the length of time that those teeth have to undergo that force. Now, I'm not saying don't extract teeth and then move them with aligners. For example, in this case here, when there is an obvious tooth that is out of the arch, it is okay to plan to extract that tooth initially and then move the rest of the teeth into that space. There is no amount of like distalization, IPR, none of that stuff that you're going to be able to do to fit this tooth in here. So when you have a case like that, you can plan to just extract it, and then you immediately begin the treatment. And so the reason why you don't wait is because when you have an extraction site, you've already created that inflammation in the area. So that bone is it's going to want something to move into it. So you will be able to easily move teeth into the space that you need. And those are things, when we get into like the case setup part of the talk, you're going to know, you'll be able to mark it and identify it. Like if you're planning an extraction, you can set that off from the beginning. Okay? And so these are the three different arch shapes that I was telling you guys about. On the left, that's going to be your nice rainbow. Then you've got the narrow arch there in the middle. You can see as you lose the space in the front, you get the crowding, and that's where the constriction happens. And then in the omegas, you've got constriction actually in the middle of the arch here. And so those are the three different arch types. Now, an easy way to solve crowding would be expansion, right? Since crowding happens because of the narrow arches, since they're narrow, just make them not narrow. But when you do that, you're going to want to expand and basically procline everything out, okay? So that narrow V arch, you would basically be moving everything to the buccal, and that would create that space. And proclination is the movement that is very predictable for single-rooted conical teeth because you're not going to need any attachments. You can literally just, the plastic wraps around the teeth, and then it provides force, and then you can just tip those teeth right out. It's super simple, and that's stuff that is very easy for aligners to do. People like this technique who are airway dentists because this gives you more space for the tongue, and it opens up everything for the patient, right? So a lot of dentists, when they see crowding, they want to hit expansion, and they just want to open everything up. And for this case, we did that, but we did premolar expansion. Okay, there was molar expansion that was planned, but it actually didn't express. And so you may be thinking like, well, if it was planned, like why didn't it work? Well, the way aligners work is just because you see it on the graphic doesn't mean that it's actually going to happen. And so this was a case where I actually did it early on, and I got lucky in that regard because and this may happen to you guys too, but like I saw the animation and I'm like, this looks great, let's do this. And we did it, and then we got a pretty nice result that you see up at the top. I'm like, wow, this is awesome, like everything worked. But when I went over the case with my mentor, they told me, they're like, yeah, congrats on the case, but not all your movements expressed. And I was like, oh, what do you mean? She's like, your molars didn't move. And I was like, what do you mean? I was like, everything expanded. Like, of course it did. She's like, no, they didn't. She's like, your premolars moved, and that's how you got the space. But the planned, millimeter of molar expansion didn't actually happen. So this is very common. Like, doctors will get lucky even though movements don't express. However, a lot of doctors will get unlucky, and all of a sudden you've got things like posterior open bites, and teeth are not cases are not tracking, stuff like that. So This is just something to keep in mind as a technique where expansion is good. I usually prefer doing premolar expansion, and we'll dive more into the molars later. So yeah, like I said with this, it's sometimes you can't do expansion, right? Sometimes the alveolar bone is just too thin. And so by expanding, you'll do stuff that Adam's orthodontist said where you'll blow through the cortical plate, right? So you can't, it's not foolproof. The jaw sizes might be different. You might have class 2, you might have class 3. Patient may have tongue thrusts, their cheeks could be pushing in, their lips could be incompetent. There's a bunch of different variables at play.
So if you're enjoying this video or found it helpful in any way, I'd really appreciate it if you could just share it with one of your dentist friends. Just copy the link, drop it in your favorite group chat, or post it in one of your favorite Facebook groups or communities, and just share it. That's it. My mission at the end of the day is to make aligner education accessible to as many dentists as possible. And so by sharing this video, you're gonna help me move closer to this goal, and I really appreciate your support.
And so a predictable and repeatable way to create space and resolve crowding is by IPR. So IPR, what is it? Basically, you're creating space by removing the friction between the teeth so that you can move the teeth into a correct position, right? So it's friction-based thinking to create space. And think about the teeth, like if they're crowded, you're trying to drive them past each other, right? You're trying to move them into a spot. And so if my hands are the teeth and there's no space, there's all this friction. So what you do is if you create a little bit of, you remove the friction, now you can actually have the teeth kind of glide back and forth. So think of it more of friction than anything else. And the next thing is, why are dentists afraid of it? Well, I was also terrified of IPR because it seems very destructive. All right, does anybody who has done IPR raise your hand? How many of you don't like doing IPR? How many of you don't really care, think it's fine and you're comfortable? Okay, yeah. Neil's proudly raising his hand. He's like, oh, IPR all day. So I think it's helpful to know this is part of the process, right? It's like when you're doing a crown, you have to remove tooth structure to get the end result. Doing a crown, I think you're removing way more healthy tooth structure than doing IPR on a couple teeth. But as GPs, we are all terrified to remove 0.3 millimeters between teeth, and it's okay. And I'm going to talk you guys through some different ways that you can do it and kind of have the confidence to do so. But at the core, it's just, I know for me, it's I didn't understand it. So when someone's like, hey, create space between these two teeth that don't have any cavities or cracks in them, I'm like, why would I do that? That sounds terrible. That doesn't sound good at all. But what I really needed was I just needed to understand why, and I needed a couple strategies to be able to do it predictably. And so I honestly don't love doing it. It's not something where I see IPR in the schedule and I'm just like, let's go, doing some IPR today. We're gonna have a good time. It's not the best, but I know that it helps us get to the result. And so it's very much something that you have to have confidence in being able to pull off if you're going to do aligners.
So if you found one nugget in this training and you found it valuable, you need to go watch this video that I made. We go deeper in these aligner concepts. I'll see you in there.